Everyone, and welcome to this short lecture. Well, maybe not that short today, actually, because I've got a bit to say about this book. But again, as per my habit, I want to avoid focusing too much on the book and let you guys come to your own conclusions in terms of reading it. Again, as usual, I'm going to set the context more than anything, but I do want to make a couple points about the book, actually, in this instance. And I also want to focus in on one of the chapters to do with the Asian financial crisis, because as it happens, that was the topic I focused on for my master's degree, and I was actually able to go to Asia, Southeast Asia, where the financial crisis happened in 1997. That's when I was writing my master's degree, and do a little traveling around there and read some of the local media and check some things out. And I was very young, but I was very impressed by people like Stiglitz. This book that we're reading for this week was not written back then, but the chapter that he includes on the Asian financial crisis is really striking. So let's just say a little bit about the book, and let's try to talk a little bit about the Asian financial crisis then, okay? And then when we meet in class, we can discuss some of the nitty-gritty, and I'll be interested in your comments and thoughts from the reading. Okay, so Stiglitz, very sort of well-known economist, really. This book, Globalization and Its Discontents, made him relatively well-known, but he was known already before then. He's quite an achiever. He's winner of a Nobel Prize in Economics in 2011. Interestingly, the Nobel Prize in Economics is not quite the same thing as a regular Nobel Prize, because it's actually awarded by a somewhat different organization, but it's called the Nobel Prize in Economics. He's a former senior vice president and chief economist of the World Bank. He's considered to be the fourth most influential economist in the world per citation indexes, and Globalization and Its Discontents, I think, would be very, very popular on student bookshelves all around the world. It's considered a classic in sort of setting up the criticism of neoliberal globalization. And we've looked at books in this class from Jeffrey Sachs, we've looked at William Easterly, and we've thought a lot about some of the things that these books have to say in terms of sort of setting up, on the one hand, the pro-aid argument, on the other hand, the a sort of pro-market argument, if there is one in Easterly. He's a pro-market guy at the end of the day, I believe, with some caveats. But Stiglitz really is coming along here as the first person to kind of take a step back from the whole thing and say, hey, look, okay, this aid thing, really, who's it suiting? Who are the interests, and what's the agenda behind it all? He's the first kind of sort of radical commentator. Now, he's not that radical, really, because he's no Marxist. He's not anti-market, per se. He's a fairly mainstream economist. You're not going to get to be president of the World Bank, a senior vice president of the World Bank, unless you are fairly mainstream in nature. So this is not a guy that's going to be talking about, class warfare or raising red flags anywhere. He is not a communist or a Marxist or a socialist. He is a capitalist, but a capitalist, you might say, with a conscience, and it is the acute sense of his conscience and his experience of some of the sort of negative effects that can come from a dogmatic clinging to free market ideology that he sort of argues is the problem. Now, if you remember, Jeffrey Sachs says aid is the problem, okay, and debt relief. Easterly says the problem is not enough market forces. Here actually is Stiglitz saying the problem is that we've, for years, decades in fact, been pursuing nothing but market forces, really, and the time has come for a change. So this is a very strong response to people like Easterly, and there's a lot of data and a lot of support for Stiglitz's argument in his book, and it's something you'll need to keep all this data in consideration as you're weighing up the pros and cons of whether you think Easterly or Stiglitz is more convincing in your mind as we go on. He's written a lot of other books, though, Stiglitz. He's written Making Globalization Work, which is a popular book, again, with students. And more recently, he's written The $3 Trillion War, which is his explanation of the actual true cost of America's wars in Afghanistan and Iraq over the last 10 years or 13 years. So let's put Stiglitz in context. We'll go into more detail about some of these sorts of things as we move through this semester. But the most important thing to remember is that Stiglitz comes out of a context that we sometimes describe as Keynesian, to do with the fact that he supports Keynesian economics. So who was Keynes, or what was Keynes? We will go into this in more detail in a future class. But for now, the important point to bear in mind is that many economists between the two wars, World War I and World War II, believed that world wars were effectively the result of overly aggressive and harsh financial penalties that were imposed on Germany in World War II, and they also were very, very concerned about the state of the economy in the United States and around the world as well, in the context of the Great Depression, which it was thought to have emerged in the 20s as a result of just rather too aggressive pursuit of free market policies. If you remember from the movie, great movie to watch in the context of trying to understand this, if you remember the James Stewart movie, It's a Wonderful Life, you see what happened, a little metaphor of our vignette about what happened in the Great Depression, where we see that because of the lack of regulation and controls on the bank was able to take the people's savings and bet them all on risky gambles on Wall Street. And one of the things that people like Stiglitz were keen to remedy was the potential for this kind of behavior down the road, because if you leave doors like that open for Main Street banks, or downtown banks, if you will, where you and I and ordinary people do our banking, if you leave doors open for them to play games with those savings on the big boys banks, on the markets for the big boys where they're large Wall Street trading firms and that kind of thing, they will inevitably lead to instabilities, larger instabilities in the financial marketplace. Keynes was also worried about how economies should recover from crises, and he believed that ultimately, at the end of the day, because the market conditions were not present for private enterprise to feel there was a basis for investment in the economy, i.e. there was no demand in the economy because no one had any money, that basically the government had to step in and create the demand artificially, and that way private enterprise would see a reason to produce things and to employ people to produce those things, because there were people to buy things. If you don't have people who are interested in buying things, then no matter how much you cut taxes, producers will not produce because there's no one there to buy anything. So it's just sort of it's an argument that comes from Keynes. Some people today would say it sounds a bit socialist, but actually for Keynes, he wasn't a socialist at all, and Stiglitz, following in his footsteps, is not a socialist either. They're simply trying to make a common sense argument about the basis of economic growth in capitalist society. When you have a crisis, sometimes you have to let go. Sometimes you have to back off from your commitment to the free market. The market will not remedy all the problems. So out of World War II then came this tremendously sort of optimistic view based on the success of Keynesian economics and its understanding of the causes and solutions for financial crises, that we could do more to help people. The question has been, the question is, how has that optimism fared historically? Today, when it comes to thinking and dealing with global poverty, we still very much rely on the institutions that were established to help global governance after World War II, the IMF, the World Bank, what is currently known as the World Trade Organization, used to be known as the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. But all these institutions sort of came out under the United Nations framework, affiliated with the United Nations framework after World War II. But the problem is, Stiglitz is arguing, I guess this is at the core of his complaint, is that while those institutions used to be backed up by a commitment on the part of the governments to the kind of investment that Keynes was spirited towards, today, because of the changing nature of the global economy, especially because of events that happened in the 1970s, the energy and the financial resources to support those missions is no longer there, and so consequently these organizations have had to change. And they have not changed for the best, because ultimately what Stiglitz is arguing is that we're still facing huge problems in the world economy today. As he notes, 28% of children in Sierra Leone die before reaching their 5th birthday. In India, only half the children are, more than half the children are malnourished. In Bangladesh, just half the adult men and fewer than 1/4 of the adult women can read or write. So, and also in 50 of the world's poorest countries, almost half are slipping backwards in terms of development. So that's the 50 poorest countries of the world. Almost half of them are actually going backwards in terms of development, which is really grim as a prospect. And so the question is, what happened in the 1970s to change direction in the IMF, the World Bank, the World Trade Organization, where these institutions were maybe making progress with poverty relief beforehand. Since the 1970s, their direction, their sort of theoretical framework and their policy framework have changed. And this is not really a book. I mean, Stiglitz calls it Globalization and its Discontents, and that's fair enough. But what this book is really about is about the politics of how these theories have changed in the IMF, the World Bank, and the kind of negative impacts that they have had on the task and the mission of development. Okay, so these organizations had to respond to these changes in the 1970s. Principally, these changes were, of course, you may remember from your history, in the early 70s, in 1973, President Nixon encountered the oil shocks, and this had major ramifications for the way the global economy was organized. Since World War II, the United States had been committed to the Bretton Woods system and the gold standard that was part of that Bretton Woods system. And the Bretton Woods system was a facility whereby the US dollar was linked to the price of gold and in an inflexible manner. And the idea was that countries around the world could hold on to the US dollar as a kind of as good as gold resource in their central banks in case they would have trouble with their own currency. They could use those dollars that they were holding in reserve, again as good as gold, to buy up their currency and restore stability in the market. So what was nice about the system, for as long as it lasted, 30 years after World War II, was that it created stability and predictability for the global businessmen that were emerging at the time, the global corporations that were pretty new on the scene at the time, but they enjoyed very much having the stability. In the 1970s, however, because of the Vietnam War and the cost of it, President Nixon could no longer maintain the commitment of the United States government to backing gold to the dollar, and this link was contingent ultimately on the ability of the United States to credibly have enough gold in the bank to cover the dollars that it was issuing. If the French, and as what happened, the French turned up in a ship in Hudson Bay and said, "We have all these dollars. Where's our gold?" And given that gold and the dollar were supposed to be interchangeable, in theory, the French should have been able to walk away with a ship full of gold for all the dollars that they had in their ship. But the problem is, of course, they had called Nixon's bluff. Nixon was printing money in order to pay United States debts for the Vietnam War, and so there were more dollars than could realistically be backed up with gold, and so the system came tumbling down because one country after another realized that the bluff was being called and the credibility in the system was collapsing. So Nixon delinked from the price of gold. He delinked the dollar from gold, and the result was that the global economy was no longer going to be so stable because no one could necessarily depend on the price of the dollar anymore. Now, another thing that happened, interestingly enough, was that a lot of the oil-producing countries in the Middle East were becoming more powerful at the time, and they were starting to lend money to newly emergent developing countries around the world, which had kind of been doing well, or it was sort of enjoying some benefits from that. But there's a famous textile crisis. The microfiber treaty was signed around then, wherein Western countries agreed that they would no longer be importing unlimited amounts of textiles from these third world emerging countries. And so these countries which had borrowed money from the Arab governments, from the Middle Eastern governments, and those governments were flush with dollars at the time from the fact that they were riding the rising tide of oil consumption in the world, suddenly found that they could no longer pay off all the debts that they had taken on. And so given the new reality, the fact that these third world countries were in debt and that the global economy was no longer linked to the price of gold, there was instability, and Nixon, with America in debt as one of the major backers of these global institutions, could no longer funnel cash into them to help out in their mission, these organizations had to adopt to new circumstances. High debt in these emerging countries, the fact that their markets were unstable, their ability to export their products to Western markets was now unreliable. There had to be all kinds of new frameworks developed in order to be able to manage the situation. So today, then, they were going to start, from the 1970s onwards, they were going to start pursuing a new type of aid regime. And the word of the day was going to be neoliberalism, which is a handy approach if you're no longer willing to support these emerging countries with cash from your own bank. You're going to basically say, haha, the free market is going to do the job where the aid was being used beforehand, and all you're going to have to do is reform your economies to make the free market your basic platform, and all good things will come from this. And Stiglitz's argument in this book, if this book is about nothing else, it's about the negative history of aid and development that has taken place since this turning point in the world economy. So let's talk about Stiglitz's basic view. What happens when people Stiglitz basic view as an economist. What happens when people in the market lack the key information they require in order to make a necessary decision, right? He's basically about the idea that sometimes there's a problem with the free market. The free market can be great, he says. He loves the free market, actually, especially when it works. But sometimes it doesn't work. And so, as he says in the text, whenever information is imperfect and markets incomplete, which is to say always, right? Markets are always effectively somewhat incomplete, and not everyone has full information about what's going in the market, but especially in developing countries, then the invisible hand works most imperfectly. So what's the invisible hand here, right? Well, basically, the invisible hand is a term that was coined by Adam Smith, who wrote in the early 19th century a book called The Wealth of Nations. And Adam Smith is often considered to be the founding father of modern economics. And here we see in Adam Smith, really for the first time, somebody basically making an argument that the market itself has a kind of a dynamic of its own, right? You can actually sort of study it scientifically. It has tendencies, it has patterns, and those patterns are based on human behavior. And human behavior, of course, is rooted by human nature, or determined by human nature. And we might say that this is going to be chaotic, right? Because human nature, left in conditions of anarchy, can be unruly. But when framed by property rights and by a government system in a state, this freedom of space to operate in the marketplace is actually quite interesting because it develops patterns, and it is as if Adam Smith says, there's an invisible hand that guides the allocation of resources. And basically what he means by that, if you remember back to last week when we were talking about William Easterly, you remember that at the start of the Easterly book he talks about the Harry Potter case, right, which is this miraculous thing where by a producer and a supplier of a certain book was able to link up with people who demanded this book all around the world simultaneously in a globally synchronized release of a product. And he says this is really an amazing example of how people who want something and people who can make that thing can sort of work together to produce a happy outcome for everyone. So there's a supplier and a demander in this case, and the supply and the demand balance out well. They balance out harmoniously in order to create this situation. But look at what had to happen there. The producer had a certain amount of information about what was likely to happen and was able to take a risk based on a fairly certain thing, right, which is that every single Harry Potter fan in the universe was going to want that book. And so the producer was well founded in his assumption or his trust that things were going to work out well. And that is an example where supply and demand balance out well. You can say the invisible hand is working, right? But what's not clear for Stiglitz is where the information isn't clear, right? So especially in developing countries, there's not the information technology networks, there's not the governmental resources to provide information and transport infrastructure, for example. Also, weather conditions are more extreme sometimes. So there's a lot of unknown factors, which means that suppliers don't often know if the demanders will want the stuff that they can produce, and demanders don't often know that the suppliers will be able to get it to them. So this means that people tend to hunker down, they tend to be very shy about taking risks in the marketplace, and trust ultimately breaks down in the marketplace as well. So this would be sort of a basic overview then of Stiglitz's perspective on why markets are not the solution to all our troubles. It's because of the lack of information. Now, applying this to the question of contemporary development, we have to discuss some things, okay? So I call this slide Keynesian Economics versus the Washington Consensus. Now, as we've already said, Stiglitz is a bit of a Keynesian economist, right? When information fails, he argues psychology takes over, and I just argued that in the last slide. Now, oftentimes as well, you have in the marketplace a phenomena of groupthink, and so if you read his chapter on the 1997 Asian financial crisis, it's clear that the marketplace really did fail because they had absolutely inaccurate information about what was going on in the marketplace at that time. And I'm going to come back to this later in this lecture, so stay tuned. But the kind of policies that Stiglitz say governments can use to help mitigate against that kind of lack of information in the marketplace are expansionary monetary policies, just basically sometimes it's as simple as printing money and making sure that the government can use that cash to invest in public infrastructure, putting people back to work, just as happened in the Great Depression when Franklin Delano Roosevelt started the New Deal. Also, the government can use tax policies to create incentives, and it can also provide unemployment support for people who are out of work, making sure that they are staying healthy and that they are, happy while they are unemployed, so that they will be in good condition to return to work when market conditions return to being favorable to that. However, this kind of policy that he prefers is challenged these days, as we've argued, since the 1970s, when there were these Nixon shocks and when America could no longer, as one of the leading people paying for the IMF and the World Bank to exist and to do their work, since the 1970s, these neoliberal policies have had to come in, and when Stiglitz uses the term Washington Consensus, he's basically referring to an emerging consensus in the major institutions of U.S. government that basically Keynesian economics is a form of charity at the end of the day, and that it encourages lazy behavior and dependency, and that in order to get rid of that dependency, in order to really encourage dynamic entrepreneurialism, the IMF and the World Bank should not be spending tons of American taxpayers' money on flawed development projects in the third world. Instead, they should be using the money to create tough, lean countries that are ready with cheap labor to compete in a global marketplace where the person who can provide the cheapest labor conditions is ultimately going to be the victor. And to that end, the IMF pursues three types of basic policy which we can say roughly constitute the policy framework of neoliberalism as we know it today. The first is fiscal austerity, and he details that in and around page 45, where he talks about basically the anti-inflationary stance of the IMF, and he says that basically what the IMF has been pursuing is a kind of a policy framework that is kind of one shoe fits all. That is to say, whatever works in the Western world will also ipso facto work in the developing world, right? So we have seen, for example, in and around page 45, his discussion of how the IMF went to Korea and told their central bank that it needed to be more independent and that the government should release the central bank from being sort of subservient to government wishes, and that this central bank should focus on fighting inflation. Well, inflation wasn't particularly a risk in Korea at the time, and even then, Stiglitz argues that there's no real correlation, even in the Western world, between an independent central bank and growth or stability. So it's not clear why the Korean government was being asked to do this when Korean government was not necessarily at the same stage of development as the Western countries that tended to adopt that kind of approach. That anti-inflationary stance is not even something that's necessarily pursued in the United States of America. It's a kind of a German idea, actually, and it's rooted in the German experience of inflation in the interwar years. Stiglitz argues that it's not necessarily appropriate for Korean economy in the state of development that it was in. Perhaps as you can see on the same slide here, that expansionary monetary policy, printing lots of money so that the government can spend it in interesting projects and employing people, is more the way to go. If the central bank is going to be independent and autonomous from government, it won't be doing that, and those jobs will not be created. So that's not good for a developing country, Stiglitz is arguing. Now, another preferred framework for the IMF in its neoliberal phase is privatization. We've talked a little bit about privatization in the context of Jeffrey Sachs already, and his involvement in the overnight liberalization and privatization of the Russian markets and the downfall in the aftermath and the wake of the downfall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of the Soviet economy. These sort of shocks, these austerity shocks and privatization shocks that Naomi Klein criticizes are important to think about here. Now, if you look on page 53 and page 54, you see Stiglitz saying that even though privatization can be useful sometimes it's ridiculous. He discusses, for example, the plight of government distribution of chickens in Morocco. And the government was told by the IMF that these government services all had to go. And so the government basically sold off its apparatus for distributing these chickens overnight. And what Stiglitz says is that this is kind of crazy because the country had kind of a dependency on this mechanism, and the IMF was naive in this regards, thinking that private chicken distributors were going to just pop up overnight, and that's not what happened. It actually takes a while for this adjustment to take place, and it needs to be planned and thought through a little more carefully. Doing it overnight, all that meant was that people didn't have their chickens, and that a lot of people were going to suffer as a result of that. So check out page 54 for more details on that case, but it's very, very interesting, and I think it's a strong example of the kind of thinking that Stiglitz brings to this question. If you also look at page 59, he talks about liberalization. He says sometimes it can be helpful, but basically, as the Asian financial crisis attests, if you liberalize your market, if you open up the flows of currency in and out of your country so that it can all happen overnight, you're creating this situation whereby things can happen very, very quickly, and we're going to talk about this in the Asian financial crisis context in just a little while. But the important thing to know here is that market liberalization is not always your friend, and it can, especially for developing countries, the ability to move cash in and out of the country overnight means that if the markets feel great about you one day, they can all move in. And if the markets don't, because global markets, especially in currencies, are like a popularity contest, if you suddenly become, as we all know can happen in high school, the unpopular kid overnight, this can happen, then you have no resilience in the face of these fickle group psychology dynamics in the global marketplace. If the market's moving one way one day, you could be beneficiary. If the market's moving the other way the next day, you could be the net loser. So smart developing countries keep their currency controls fairly balanced so that they get this just right. But the IMF was advocating complete relaxation of these controls, and of course with the benefits were also going to come incredible risks, and the IMF realized that to its peril in 1997 in the context of the Asian financial crisis. But there's a lovely example also on page 70 about Bolivia, and how the Bolivian banks were all taken over by foreign banks. When the foreign cash dried up, the Bolivian banks, consequently, because they were owned by foreign banks, all sort of went down, and people couldn't get cash, and there was a currency crisis in Bolivia. So that's very interesting to read about. So the bottom line, anyway, from if you look at all of these points that he's making, is that basically that the neoliberal model, or sometimes it's called trickle-down economics, that it doesn't work. It doesn't work in the West generally, as we're finding out in the context of the recent financial crisis here, which has happened since this book was published. But if you look, Stiglitz has written a lot about that elsewhere. Trickle-down economics has not worked, but whatever about the West, it certainly has not worked elsewhere in the world. It has not worked in these developing countries. So it's just important that we keep that in mind.